Throughout World War II, there were many men who rose to prominent positions inside of the concentration camps. Their reputations were built upon cruelty and torture, but also upon sending thousands of people to their deaths inside of gas chambers. The commandants of the concentration camps oversaw thousands of inmates, but one of the most infamous was the Beast of Belsen, Josef Kramer, a man who found himself inside of Allied captivity in 1945. He was actually arrested at his own camp, having refused to flee, and he actually showed the liberators his sight proudly, despite the fact there were around 13,000 unburied corpses lying everywhere. For Kramer, his death toll was a personal and significant milestone, and it was something that he was proud of, running a camp where every week hundreds were succumbing to disease. But he would be condemned to death following trial, and upon the gallows within Hamelin prison, he was executed, bringing the disgusting and shocking life of the Beast of Belsen to an end. In this video, we look at the execution of Josef Kramer, and to support our channel, please click subscribe down below. Josef Kramer was born in November 1906 within Munich, and his family moved to Augsburg later in his childhood. He had a relatively normal life, and there was nothing to suggest that he would become one day a brutal and barbaric beast. He trained as an apprentice electrician as a teenager, and then worked later inside of a department store, and then as an accountant. But like so many people in the 1920s, he experienced a significant time unemployed because of the economic issues plaguing the world following the Wall Street crash, and he actually became rather poor. Kramer felt annoyed, and he began to develop a hatred in his mind. He believed that he deserved better as a German, but at the same time there was a fledgling political party inside of Germany that would, let's say, grip his attention. The Nazis rose to prominence in the 1930s, especially following Hitler's release from prison, and Hitler realised to take power he needed to do it through legitimate political means. Kramer joined the Nazis early on in 1931, years before Hitler had become Chancellor. He also joined the SS in 1932, and at the time this was a small bodyguard detachment who were tasked with keeping a close watch on high-ranking Nazis to ensure they were safe at rallies and at different meetings. They were a bodyguard force really, but through his SS training, Josef Kramer then took up a job inside of a prison. He remained there for a year or so, and then in 1934 he was sent by the SS to go and work inside of Dachau concentration camp as a guard. Dachau was the first camp opened inside of the Third Reich, and it was to begin with a place where the enemies of Hitler were locked up, and huge numbers of communists were sent there. It was, though, where many future commandants of other camps learned their trade and became brutal. Kramer was no exception, and he was promoted quickly and became a senior guard at Sachsenhausen and also Mauthausen. But then in 1940, he was called himself by Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, to go and work inside of a different camp, the largest site of mass slaughter during the Second World War, Auschwitz. Personally, he had been selected to become the assistant to Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, who built the camp from the ground up. Kramer got on very well with Höss, and they shared a very similar brutal outlook on things politically, and Kramer was present when Höss inspected Auschwitz as a possible site for a new synthetic oil and rubber plant that would later become Auschwitz-free Monowitz. It was clear that Kramer would one day get his own camp to run. In April 1941, he was named the commandant of the Natzweiler Struthof concentration camp in what is today French territory and lands. He instigated a brutal regime there, based upon punishment and torture, and he also carried out scores of executions in the same manner that Rudolf Höss was doing at Auschwitz. Kramer, in particular, had 80 prisoners gassed so their remains could be used as a specimen inside of a school collection in the Reich University of Strasbourg. The corpses of these were then sent to the man in charge of the exhibition, August Hirt. After a brief spell in charge of Natzweiler, Kramer was sent back to Auschwitz II-Birkenau. This was the main extermination part of Auschwitz, and it was where the killings took place. He worked there roughly for around a year, and he was brought in to manage the gassings of new transports. He worked there for a significant time and was brought in to help manage the gassings of new transports. At this time in the war, there were thousands arriving at Auschwitz every day, and they were being driven into the gas chambers. Kramer was involved in overseeing Operation Hearse, in which around 450,000 people were gassed and killed at Auschwitz in one summer in roughly 50 days. There were so many bodies that the crematoria could not keep up, so people were burned in the open in mass pits all around the site. Kramer was responsible for also taking part in selections, as when civilians came to the camp, they would be selected to either go to the gas chambers for extermination, or they would be admitted into the camp to work. He was playing God with people's lives, selecting who would live and who would die. He then took it upon himself to load people onto the trucks that took them to the gas chambers, and he beat them when they tried to resist. One former doctor who actually worked with Josef Kramer later stated that he tried to get out of doing the jobs that Kramer ordered him to do, as it was so violent and disturbing. But this doctor later recounted that Kramer replied with, and I quote, "I know you are being investigated for favouring prisoners. I'm now ordering you to go to the ramp, and if you fail to obey an order, I shall have you arrested on the spot." Josef Kramer was someone who was not to be crossed or messed with, and was even terrifying for those who worked alongside him. In December 1944, he left Auschwitz for the final time, and was made the Commandant of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Belsen was at the time in the war a place where thousands of prisoners were being sent to, as other camps were being evacuated. The site was in a terrible way when Kramer arrived, but he made things absolutely worse. There were no gas chambers at Belsen, but Kramer's rule was so tough and barbaric that he became known as the Beast. As inmates were given little to no food, disease was running rampant, and he did nothing to help this, and insisted that the guards either shot and slaughtered inmates if they did not follow orders. As the end of the Second World War came around, things at Belsen got much worse, and Kramer remained as the commandant. He did file a report asking for help and resources, but nothing arrived, and he claimed that around 300 prisoners a day were dying from typhus. But Kramer, besides that, did nothing, and he believed that the inmates deserved their fate. Further numbers of prisoners arrived at Belsen, and the corpses of the dead were not buried, as other inmates were too exhausted, and there was nowhere to inter them. But when the camp was liberated, what the Allies found was shocking. As mentioned, 13,000 unburied corpses lay everywhere that needed burying quickly, and there were thousands more who were close to death, and many would die in the days after liberation. Belsen became a place synonymous with Nazi crimes and suffering. Now, Josef Kramer, to begin with, was actually not arrested when the camp was liberated, and he even gave the British a tour of his site, and he seemed relatively pleased with his work inside the decimated camp. But then he was finally arrested, and was held in leg cuffs, and was locked up alongside the other captured and arrested guards of Belsen, such as Irma Grazer. Kramer was not, it's believed, involved in the mass cleanup of the site as much as the other guards were, due to the high-ranking position he held and the interrogation that he was under. He was then locked up inside of Hamlin prison and was brought alongside 44 other members of Belsen's staff to trial. The Belsen trials was a British military court aimed to punish those men and women who had caused so much suffering. What Kramer said about his work at Belsen and Auschwitz was rather shocking, and he tried to claim he knew very little, but sometimes he stumbled over things and made mistakes whilst trying to convince the courtroom that he was innocent. He was asked about the gas chambers and claimed, and I quote, "I received a written order from him that I had nothing to do with either the gas chambers or the incoming transports. The political department, which was in every camp, had a card index system of prisoners and was responsible for personal documents and for any sorts of transports or incoming prisoners. At Auschwitz, the political department was also responsible for all selections from incoming transports for the gas chamber. In the crematorium, the SS and prisoners, Sonderkommando, were under the command of the Commandant of Auschwitz, Hearse. As the place where the transports generally arrived was in the middle of my own camp, I was sometimes present at their arrival. The people who took part in supervising and who were responsible for the security were partly from Auschwitz No. 1 and partly from my own camp at Birkenau, but the selections of these people who had to supervise was done by the Commandant of Auschwitz I. The actual selections of the internees were made only by the doctors. So, to begin with, he claimed he had nothing to do with selections and the gas chambers, then admitted he was present, and then tried to make up a load more lies. Kramer tried to say he had appealed for more food and supplies at Belsen, but the suffering he inflicted himself was undeniable. He even admitted he was a man of God, but the shocking crimes of Belsen made people think how anyone could do such a thing. He was found guilty of crimes against humanity at Bergen-Belsen and also at Auschwitz, and because of this, Josef Kramer was sentenced to death. He was sent back to Hamelin prison to await his death sentence. The man who would be the executioner for the condemned Belsen guards was Albert Pierpoint, the experienced British executioner. Pierpoint would bring many people's lives to an end at the end of the Second World War, and Kramer would actually be one of his first victims. On the 13th of December 1945, Josef Kramer's execution took place. He was 39 years old. He was placed into the condemned cells, and at the bottom of the corridor there were 2 gallows constructed and created inside the makeshift execution chamber. Pierpoint first executed the women individually, with Irma Greiser, Elisabeth Falkenrath and Johanna Bormann going through the gallows. Then it was the turn of Josef Kramer. But Pierpoint executed the men in pairs. Kramer was brought forward, it's believed, from his cell, along with the former doctor of Belsen and Auschwitz, Fritz Klein. These 2 men who had caused so much suffering would be executed together at the same time on the same gallows. They were led into the execution chamber and were helped up the gallows after their identities were confirmed. Pierpoint days before had met with Kramer to confirm his height and weight, and he worked out the long drop required to snap his neck. The rope was already set for Kramer, and Pierpoint led him onto the trapdoor and then placed a cap over his head so he couldn't see his final moments. He was asked for any final words, and these were recorded, but then Pierpoint performed a few final checks as he placed and tightened the noose around the Beast of Belsen's neck. Pierpoint then released the trapdoor, and Josef Kramer fell straight to his death, and his neck was instantly snapped, bringing about his death within just a matter of seconds. But this wasn't actually the end of Kramer's story. He was actually buried inside of Hamelin prison's courtyard, and he was dug up from his grave decades later, and his body is buried today inside of Hamelin's Amvel cemetery. But he was a man of immense brutality, and someone who was responsible for at least 100,000 people's deaths as he worked overseeing Auschwitz-Birkenau. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.